kind of neat. We have people all over kind of following this series. I guess for the first time I should look at the camera and welcome the Scenary Bible Study in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Rob and Amanda used to go to church here. Listen to that, Rob and Amanda. We got a round of applause. Their whole small group is actually going through the whole study with us. Watching the video, going through the devotional, going through James' questions. John and Heidi Corrant listening in North Carolina every single week. More stops for John and Heidi. It's getting fewer and fewer John and Heidi, so nobody knows you're here early anymore. No bother, no need to come back. Thank you to Nate Milheim. Wow, what a sermon last week if you were here. How many of you were here last week to hear Nate? Unbelievable. I'm just sitting in a puddle of tears by the time he was done. No need to talk about that anymore. So, Romans. If you have a Bible in your chair, if you don't have one, we'll be turning to chapter 4 this morning. To recap what we've done, we have this kind of strange, unique church where for the first time in the growth of the church after Jesus' resurrection, the Christians, we'll call them, followers of Jesus, we have now, for the first time ever, Jewish followers of Jesus joining Gentiles. Remember, they got kind of kicked out of Rome. And so you have a Gentile church now instead of a synagogue of Jesus followers with Jews joining them. And they're having trouble with perspective. They're having trouble seeing why they should be together. And Paul would like to start in chapter 12 and just go from there and tell them what it means that God has done to put them together, how significant it is that they are together, and how to live well together in unity. That they're really not two communities anymore, they're really one community. But he can't do that because they have some fundamental issues with each other and more importantly with God. And so in a sense, the first 11 chapters of this book are really a trial scene, if you will, where God's integrity is on trial. The word in the Bible is righteousness. God's righteousness is in question, meaning his trustworthiness, his loyalty. And it's in two respects. First of all, has God actually come through on what he said he would do? God said he was going to fix life through Abraham's family. Thank you so much for that. He said he was going to fix God's family through the seed of Abraham, the Jews. How has he done that? And then on top of that, the greater issue is, life's a mess. Show me how it is God is fixing the world in any way when the world looks like it does today. Paul's emphatic answer in this scene is that Jesus, he says this in the first 4 verses as well as verses 16 and 17 in chapter 1, that Jesus proves that God has been faithful. Jesus is kind of the apex, if you will, of everything God has said, that he is the one that fulfills the promises of the Old Testament. And he, as crowned king, which is what we looked at in verse 4 of chapter 1, he was declared Son of God. He is the crowned king of the universe now, and he is in the process of putting things back together. It's all kind of encapsulated in this statement in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. The gospel, meaning the story of God's redemption, culminating in Jesus, is the power of God to save all. And Jesus' faith proves God has come through on his promises so that we can now exercise faith back in him, from faith to faith. But before Paul can do this, he wants to establish a very clear thought. And so he begins this argument in 1:18, and he doesn't finish it until chapter 3, verse 20. And what he says is, before we begin to pelt God with questions about whether he's trustworthy, let's make one point very clear. God is not on trial. God is the great judge, robed in glory. He is the great one. He stands above us. And you and I are in complete sin and guilt before him. So Paul says, don't think that this trial is actually between us and God. It's just us, period. So Paul, as lawyer, before he defends God, says, first of all, let's make sure that's clear. All of humanity has stepped away from God and ignored him and degraded themselves in the way they live. And then he turns in chapter 2 and says, and for those of you, and he means the Jews specifically, but I think there's deep application for church kind of followers, if you will. He says, for those of you that attempt to live right and attempt to follow God, you're worse than the pagan because you sin like they do, and on top of that, you think you're better and are judgmental. And then in chapter 3, he turns to this horrific argument against his people, the Jews, and himself, really, as an indictment, and says, and beyond that, not only is all of humanity guilty, not only are the religious types, specifically the Jews and the the Gentile proselytes, guilty because they sin and they're morally judgmental, but Israel itself, she has completely thrown aside her divine calling. Israel stood at the foot of Mount Sinai in Exodus 19, and God said, you are my priest to the entire world. You will make me make sense to the world. And they completely wrecked on this process. So Paul gets to the end of chapter 3, verse 20, and he says, we're all guilty before God. We are the ones that need defending, not God. And then in chapter 3, verse 21, he flips it, as Nate so eloquently shared those last 10 or so verses in chapter 3, and he says, but, even though it's absurd to question God, for one moment, let's do it. Let's see if God comes out righteous. Let's go ahead and start the trial. Let's ask God to take his robe off. And let's ask him to come down in the defendant's chair. And I, Paul, will defend God and prove that he has not only been faithful to what he promised, but he's actually fixing life right before our very eyes. And I love what Nate shared. He begins, why do we know God is righteous? He begins in 3:21, as Nate shared. What he does is he walks up and he says, here's how we know God is righteous. And he peels the curtain back, and behind the curtain is who? Jesus. He says, Jesus' faithful life and death and resurrection prove that God has come through on behalf of not only Israel, but all of humanity. Jesus has acquitted us of our guilt. He's justified us before God. And we can't brag. There's nothing to brag about. I love how Nate did that at the end of his sermon. There's no bragging. It's not like, look how my kids turned out. Look how my marriage has turned out. Look at the degrees I have. Look at my job. There's no boasting before God. We are all laid low in our guilt for not living up to the expectations of what we're supposed to. And for also refusing to do all the right things that we should do in life. See, life is, and our guilt is not just about how much we sin, but it's also about all the things that we should do that we refuse to do on the other end of the target. There's no boasting before God. It's a pure gift before the judge. And now God is guaranteeing equal access for all of us, both Jew and Gentile. He's equaled the playing field. You see, our sin equaled the playing field. The Jew and the Gentile are just as guilty as one another. God acquits us through the blood of Jesus. He declares us in the great trial of life. The judge says the verdict is in. Jesus has paid your debt. You're free to walk out, totally forgiven. And now he's equal to playing field, both Jew and Gentile as well. God's righteousness revealed, if you will, unveiled through the faithfulness of Jesus the Messiah. And it's for the benefit of all who believe. I love the statement in that last part of chapter 3 where he says, this was to demonstrate his righteousness. God's righteousness is revealed in the gospel events of Jesus' death and resurrection. God has been true to what he promised by saving the world through an Israelite. Remember, he promised in chapter 12 of Genesis, I will fix life and I will do it through an Israelite. Israel refused to do it, so God births his own son into humanity as an Israelite. See, if Jesus is not Jewish, God has not come through on his promises. Jesus comes out as a Jew and acts the part of Israel on behalf of Israel, fulfills the promise of God to Abraham in Genesis 12, and saves humanity. And he deals properly with sin. He rescues the helpless, and he does it all with impartiality. Jew, Gentile, black, white, it doesn't matter to God. So now, how does Paul continue with this huge argument that he's going to give us, that God has indeed come through? Paul's going to go through a detailed argument in chapter 4, and it's going to take us 2 Sundays to cover chapter 4, today and next week. And this chapter 4 that we're going to look at for the next 2 weeks, He's not just going to prove what God has done through Jesus from Scripture. He's going to go beyond that. He's going to do what you would expect him to do in a courtroom. What Paul is going to do is he's going to give a full-blown explanation of what the original agreement was. You know, Brian Fury and I are business partners, second. Dear brothers first. And I always tease Brian because he's been in healthcare like 25 years. I've only been doing it for 15. So, and he knows all this doctor kind of stuff. And his dad was a doctor, so we call him junior physician. Well, he handles all the contracts for our company, and so we call him a junior lawyer. He's pretty close to passing the bar there. He's really close. And so Brian and I are always joking, and when we get in these situations, like we have a relationship with Kaiser, whenever something comes up, I panic, and Brian stays calm, and Brian goes back to his office, he pulls out a filing cabinet, and guess what Brian grabs? The contract. It's 120 pages, I believe, plus another million of addendums. And Brian basically, every time there's a dispute, he just says, let's just go back to the contract and let's see what the agreement was, right? Very simple thing to do. No reason to get all our hackles up, no reason to get all stressed. That's exactly what Paul's going to do. He says, you want to know, people, if what I'm saying is true, that God has proven his righteousness through Jesus, let's go back to the original agreement that God made with the first Jew named Abraham, and let's see what the contract says. And that's what he'll do. And what he'll do as he shows this is he'll say it always included Gentiles. So as he looks at his Roman church, he's going to say it was always supposed to be Jews and Gentiles. That's what the original contract said. So don't come back to me now and say you don't like it, because that was the original agreement that Abraham and I made. So a quick outline of chapter 4. We're only going to look at number 1 this morning, that Abraham himself had nothing to boast about, because he, who was the original party to the contract, if you will, was acquitted by faith, not by something else. We'll explain that in a second. And the next week we'll look at 2, 3, and 4, that then qualified Abraham to be the spiritual father of everybody. He establishes the ground rules for what it means to be in a relationship with God. He'll expand upon that faith, and he'll do a final summary. This chapter is not about how to become a Christian. It is there, by the way, but let's never lose sight of what Paul is saying to this church. The question is, has God come through on what he promised? What was the original agreement that God made with Abraham? And his Jewish brothers have some thoughts in their head, 2 specifically. So this Jewish collection of house churches in Rome, they're thinking a couple things as Paul begins this argument. They're thinking, first of all, Abraham was the first ancestor of all our people. That's an obvious comment. And so, he's the defining person of what it means to have a covenant membership or relationship with God. Meaning, another way to say this is, figure out how God and Abraham got right with each other, and you can figure out how the rest of us get right with God. Does that make sense? Figure out what the original relationship was, how it worked, how they connected, then we'll be able to say that that's how I connect with God. And this is what Paul must prove to these believers in Rome that know Jewish history. First of all, he'll prove that Abraham joined the covenant family of God through faith. He didn't do it through some kind of ethnic privilege. Abraham did not join relationship with God through circumcision. That came way after. Abraham did not, and this is the most important one, Abraham did not join in relationship with God because God gave the Jews Torah. Now, this is a really important piece that we've talked about at length, and we'll camp on that in a little bit. But you know, the idea was, Moses goes up on the mountain after he gets them out of Egypt. He comes down. God gives them the first 5 books of the Bible, right? That's Torah. The first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It's a partial explanation of who God is, who humanity is, and how they come together. That's what the Torah is. And then he told Israel, this is yours. This is your ethnic seal that you have. I'm going to give this to you, and you now are the keepers of the explanation of life. Now you take it as priests and tell the rest of the world who I am and how we connect. And what he's going to prove in this argument is, just because you own Torah does not give you covenant rights in relationship with God. It reminds me of what Jeremy kind of read and preached on in chapter 2 of 17. He lists all the privileges, if you recall, and Jeremy would like you to say yes, of all the ethnic privileges, right, Jeremy, that the Jews had. They're incredible privileges. Circumcision, the Torah, the priestly calling. They're massive things. But this is an important point Paul will make. Don't confuse your calling with your standing before God. See, we confuse that. I have been, I hope, otherwise this has been a long 3.5 years for you. I have been gifted and called by God, gifted to understand the Word of God and teach, and called to do it in this little square right here. This is my calling. This has nothing, listen to this, nothing to do with God and I in our relationship with each other. Whether I do this or not is irrelevant in my relationship to God. I am in relationship with God because of Jesus. Amen? So even if I'm called to do this and tell God I'm not going to do this, which we've had this discussion several times, God says, that's a bummer, but we're still in relationship. And this is what Israel keeps confusing. What is our redemptive history calling versus what does it mean to be in relationship with God? The second thing that then Paul will then prove is that this family then, because Abraham is the father of this family, includes Gentiles. Again, we have to think trial. We have to think what Paul is doing here. Let's go back to the original agreement, Paul says, and find out how God established relationship with humanity, and it started with Abraham. Then we'll know how we get in. So, back to the first section. Let's begin to look at this first section. That Abraham himself had nothing to boast about, because he, the original party to the contract, was acquitted by faith. Verse 1 in Romans chapter 4, if you're already there. What then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh? Maybe a better way to translate this is, what then should we say to each other? Have we found Abraham to be our forefather according to the flesh? The question is whether covenant membership with God, whether relationship with God, means you have to be from the physical family of Abraham. That is what his audience is struggling with in this. He gives his full answer in verses 16 and 17. Listen to what Romans 4, 16 and 17 says. That is why it depends on faith, the relationship does, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring, not only to the adherent of the Torah, meaning the Jews, but also to those who share the faith of Abraham, meaning the Gentiles. Who is Abraham? Who is the father of us all? And as it is written, I have made you the father of many nations. Isn't that fascinating? He's not just the father of the Jews, he's the father of us all. In the presence of God whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. Abraham is the father of the covenant family of God, but he's not that way because of his flesh, because of physically. Back to verse 1. What then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh? This is the point of this whole chapter, to answer this one question. Are you a part of God only if you become Jewish? And if we read the rest of the chapter in this light, we'll see it. He begins to give his answer in verse 2. For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. Now this is a strange answer, but it's because I don't think we understand what the word works are. You recall this word works. He's not saying in this phrase For if Abraham was justified by doing the right thing, we hear works and we think legalism. We hear works and we think obey Torah, obey the commandments of God. That's not what this is. What he's really saying is, for if Abraham was justified by works of Torah, what that is I, God, gave the first 5 books of the Bible to you, Israel. You and I now have a deal between us. This will explain me partially, humanity partially, in our relationship to each other. Now you go tell everybody else about it. Israel turns around and they say, we've been given the works. Think of it as the scrolls. Moses comes down the mountain. It's a little steeper than this, by the way. He's got the works of Torah in his arm. And he tells everybody, I've got the works of Torah. And they say, awesome, then we are now in a relationship with God. Paul is saying, no, that's not how this works. That's a calling. Just because I give you a script and you read it does not mean that you and I are in a relationship with each other. Does that make sense? So that's what he's saying in this. Works of Torah are not just doing the Torah, though that is obviously expected. It's that I gave them Torah, and now they think, because I handed them the scrolls of Torah, that we are eternally sealed in a relationship together. And Paul is telling them, you're relying on the wrong thing. Just because you have a scroll, just because you shove the Bible in your back pocket, does not make you in a relationship with God. That's not going to fix your problem. And there's a main reason. There's actually 2 really reasons for this. See, the Jews are calling Torah as if a Torah is a person. And Torah walks into the courtroom and they say, see, Torah is our friend. Torah will defend us. And Torah turns around and says, actually, you're totally sinful. You see, Israel calls the Torah into the room to defend them, and Torah turns around and chokes them by the neck and says, here's 600 plus commandments, you can't keep hardly one of them. At the end of the day, Torah actually does the opposite of defending Israel. It says, this is how sinful you are. On top of that, Torah says, I never promised you life. You think if you have me and do me, the commandments of God, then you will actually find life. And the Torah never promised that. In fact, in the Old Testament, particularly in the first 5 books of the Bible and the Torah says, here's the Torah. By the way, you're supposed to do it, but you better depend on God. What you need to do is fall before God and have faith and trust God. And then maybe Torah will come out through your pores. That's about the only way this is going to work. You see, in the mind of these ethnic Jews, they're saying, I possess Torah, the explanation of God and life. And Abraham is the ethnic father of our people. Those 2 things together then define my relationship with God. So if any Gentile wants to be a part of us, he has to become a Jew. Do you see that? We own Torah. We own Abraham, because he's our ancestral father. You put the 2 together, and the only way you're getting into a relationship with God is if you have these 2 things. So Gentile, if you're a Gentile, then you have to become a Jew. You get circumcised, you pledge to follow all 600 plus commandments, you do everything that it requires. That is what is in their mind. This is what Paul is pushing back again. And he's going to define now what membership is. Look at verse 3. For what does the scripture say, Paul asks? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. In our trial session here, Paul now quotes the original contract. This is Brian Fury in his office, filing cabinet out. He goes to page 87, paragraph 2. I've seen you do this a million times, and he goes, right there, Doug, we got him. I mean, it's so funny. We have this relationship with Kaiser. They're enormous people. We are nothing. We're like 50, 60 employees. It's just Brian and I and Brian's sister. I mean, and then Tom and Jeremy join us. We're just this little teeny thing. But we got the contract. And Brian will always go back and go, we got it. And that's what Paul's going to do. He quotes the original agreement with Abraham. It's in Genesis 15, chapter 6. By the way, he will quote this contract agreement with Abraham 5 times in this chapter. Genesis 15 and 17. Several clarifications to this statement. Abraham believed, and it was counted to him as righteousness. First of all, and Kimberly can correct me, but do it after church, Kimberly, so I sound like I'm telling the truth, because she's our only really, really Hebrew-speaking person in here. But from what I understand, in the Hebrew, there's no word for as, A-S. So really, what the Hebrew text from what I understand, is saying it was reckoned or counted to him righteousness, which is great because as in English weakens it. It's as if we're friends. You know what I mean? She treats me as if we're friends. That's not accurate. You brought me water. I know we're friends. Right? We are friends. And that's what this is saying. He believed and God counted to him righteousness. There's the first clarification. Second of all, it was counted to him. What is the it? It's Abraham's faith. Abraham believed, and his faith, his momentary decision to basically give God the benefit of the doubt was so moving to God that he took his righteousness and he just gave it all to him. Now third, this word reckon, this word counted. Again, this is like the whole message for Brian. Is there another CPA in the house, by the way? This is a great CPA where John Payne will really... Are you a CPA too? So there's two of them, okay. Everybody else just don't even bother because I still look at spreadsheets. This is a spreadsheet term. This reckon or counted, or it's a crediting term. It means to put tick marks in the ledger so you know where you come out. This is Jeremy, thank you so much. This was Jeremy's idea. He said, Doug, show them what this looks like, right? It's a bookkeeping term, placing ticks in a column and adding them up, and here the righteousness of Jesus swaps places with our sin. So you have Abraham on one side, completely sinful before God. You have Jesus completely righteous. Abraham looks at God, he gives him the benefit of the doubt and says, I believe you'll give me a kid. That's literally what the issue was. I'll give you a kid. Okay, I think you'll give me a kid. He gives God the benefit of the doubt. He places his trust for one moment in God, and God takes his righteousness, and he removes the sin and dumps the righteousness into Abraham and his account. He accounted to Abraham righteousness that did not belong to Abraham. He accounted righteousness to Abraham that Abraham did not earn. And again, remember in our law court, God is judge. And as judge, he is the only one that can declare the guilty not guilty. And this is exactly what he does for Abraham. He acquits him. He hands Abraham the status of righteous before God. Not pretty good, not like good except for the stuff you did like 3 minutes ago, not like you and I are good, but I'm going to watch you to see how this goes. That's not it. And also, by the way, this isn't like in court today where the gavel comes down and the judge says, not guilty. And then what we do is we run out the door, right? I don't know why I was doing that, but you run out. I was really happy, apparently. And you feel free. Tom's going to really bake me over that one later. You feel totally free, totally free. No, that's not what it is. Because God's in the room. He lowers his gavel and says, you're acquitted because you trusted me for a moment. And God steps down off the throne. And you turn around and you just go, yes! This is real hugging. This isn't quarter hugging. This isn't half hugging. This isn't 3 taps and off. This is in tight relationship with each other. Wow, that got me worked up. Lastly, what I want to say about this statement, it was counted to him as righteousness. In this statement, God is equating 2 kind of big religious Christian words, righteousness and covenant. He's doing this in this way. Abraham gives God the benefit of the doubt and trusts him. God just goes crazy inside, and he declares Abraham righteous before him because he believed for a moment. And the result is now they're connected in a deep, vital, eternal relationship with each other. A covenant with each other that can never be broken because it's reliant upon God, not us. When Abraham shows faith in God, it's a sure sign that they have relationship with each other. And that's now how his faith is how you can see they belong together. And God sealed it with a covenant ceremony and promises back to him. And he'll explain what this crediting is a little further in these 2 weird verses in verses 4 and 5. Now to the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. And to the one who does not work, but trusts him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. This is a really tricky kind of couple verses. But there's just a few things that I think we draw from this as explanation. His first comment is, in verse 4, when we work as an employee for an employer, they pay us a wage. That's not a gift. Nobody has ever showed up in our company, as good as we are to them, and I know we're pretty darn good to them, right, and said, no need to pay me. This is so fun. I'm just going to come here. I worked for the phone company in the Yellow Pages for 13 years. Never once. If I would have gotten a call in the morning and say, just so you know, you're not going to be paid today, guess who's not coming in? Even bonuses, right? Not just the salary. Even a bonus, when you get a bonus, you're not like, wow, what a great company. You know what you're usually thinking? I actually deserve this bonus. In fact, it should have been a little higher, quite frankly. Right? That's a wage earner. So Paul says that's a wage earner. That's not a gift. That's working, earning. His next comment then is, God is nothing like that. God is not an employer. You're not God's slave. You're not God's employee. You're not there to do stuff for God, and then God at the end of the day says, okay, now I'm gonna take out your blessings. That's not how Christianity works with God, because that's not what God is like. God is fundamentally gracious and loving and kind, and He just wants to give. Therefore, Paul says in verse 5, God cannot credit human beings on the basis of their works, because it would cut against His very nature. He's not a wage earner. He's not an employer, which makes us wonder why we treat Him that way all the time. You see, if our relationship with God is based on our works, then it's to our glory. But if it's based on God's kindness, it's to His glory, and then the rest of the world gets to see what He's actually like. People cannot base their relationship with God based upon actions, because God is fundamentally gracious and freely gives, and it would be against His complete makeup to behave in any other way. So the progression of thought, all the way back to chapter 1 now, is this. Paul has already shown in the first 2 chapters that we're completely guilty before this judge and deserve nothing but His judgment and death. And God steps up through Jesus and acquits us of our guilt through the payment of Jesus' blood. And all He asks of us is that we turn to Jesus and say, I recognize what You did, and thank You. It's not earned, as that will go against God's giving nature. And the funniest part of this whole argument, and Paul hasn't even said this to his Jewish brethren, but I think it's hilarious. When Abraham, in the original contract, when Abraham entered into relationship with God, he was a Gentile. That's the really funny thing. The Jews are saying, oh man, they can't get in unless they become like us. And Paul is telling them, first of all, Torah came like 600 plus years after Abraham. And second of all, he was a Gentile when he knew God. And you're going to turn around in your little house churches in Rome and tell me the Gentiles don't belong? Oh, they belong. Because Abraham is their father by faith. Paul has quoted the original contract from the Torah with Abraham. And what he does now at the end of this is he will turn and now quote the writings. He's quoted the first 5 books of the Bible. Now Paul will quote the second by talking about David. He will call David now as his second witness, if you will. It's as Brian would say, an addendum to the contract. As if Abraham wasn't enough to prove how this relationship with God works, he says, let me bring up David, the second king of Israel, and the greatest king Israel has ever known. And he quotes Psalm 32 to do it. Just as David, verse 6, also speaks of the blessings of the one to whom God counts righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not reckon his sin. David was and is a forgiven sinner. David was guilty as charged, and as a righteous judge, God cannot overlook that. And God doesn't overlook it. In fact, He lowers the gavel and He says, David, you're guilty as charged. And oh, by the way, Jesus will now credit you His blood. He will credit you His righteousness, because you cannot pull it off on your own. The point Paul is bringing here at the very end of this is that the people that are blessed are not the ones that earn something. They're the ones that receive something. I can tell you this. When an employee works with me, at the end of the day, they get their paycheck. They don't feel like they owe me anything. I'll bet you the people that went to lunch at the Furies on Tom's behest feel very different. It wasn't earned. It wasn't an obligation. It was just a heartfelt expression for the two of you to open your house and to know Tom's heart, to know how Tom and Tammy wanted to bless these people. Let's close with just a couple of thoughts. Every time we try to turn our relationship with God into what I would call an equation, what I do defines how we are together. Every time we do that, it's a complete violation. And I mean to use that word. It's a violation of the relational agreement we have with God. This is not how Abraham and God were established, therefore it's not how you and I are established. God freely gives. Every time we turn a relationship with God into an equation, it's a direct violation also of who God is fundamentally. God is not an employer. Don't treat him that way. If you, in the middle of your day, at the end of your week, at the end of your day, you're wrestling with, oh my gosh, I didn't do so well this week. I'm not sure where God and I are at with each other. You're violating the very character of who God says he is. Knock it off. How's that for strong? God doesn't want you to spend one moment with that because you're not really relating with God because that's not who God is. You've created your own employer God, and now that's who you're worshiping. Knock it off. That's a terrible, terrible God to worship. Because it's not the God of the Bible. It's just some piece of wood you carved out for yourself, like I do. And now you're thinking you're somehow earning your way into his favor. On top of that, it's a violation of the truth. Abraham was given a thought from God. Abraham said, I'll take you at your word. And God dumped his righteousness freely into him and said, don't think for a second you have to earn this. And Abraham said, don't worry, because I know I can't. I know I'm a schmuck, and I know I will make it one day, earning my way into your favor. This is how we're supposed to live. And the thought that goes with this is, if your day is about focusing on your sin, you're toast. You're just toast. I've been in church a long time. I've heard a lot of sermons. I've heard a lot of Christian radio. I've just heard a lot of all this stuff. And, at the end of the day, it's like, man, you got 15 things you got to better do or toe the line as a Christian, and it all weighs down on you. There's no life in that. You know why? Because it's turning God into a wager. It's exactly what Paul says God is not. He's a free, given, loving dude. And when we feel that, when we know how righteous we are, when we feel it to our toes, here's the crazy, miraculous thing. We just end up doing the right thing. I can't explain it. It's miraculous. Read Psalm 119. It's like the longest psalm in the Bible. Over and over, it's like, man, I want to do your ways. I want to follow your ways. I want to obey your commands. And then at the end of that little phrase, it'll say, but I can't do it unless you do it through me. I'm dependent upon you, my free giving Father. Don't tarnish this. Don't tarnish the cross. Don't fall into the trap of thinking you're somehow doing Christianity by telling God, thanks for the blood of Jesus, now let me help you out a little bit so that you and I are in better shape together. That's an affront to God. The Father hears that and says, do not treat my son that way. He did it all. He didn't do 90% of it for you. He didn't do 99% of it for you. He died and poured himself out for you, and then freely looked at me as the judge and said, I declare them acquitted before me. They're free. Let them dance and sing and be in joy because I've washed them by the blood of my son. Amen? Don't let your flesh lie to you with what isn't the truth about your relationship with God. It's not on you. It's on Him. Thank Jesus. Amen. Let's pray. Wow. Maybe there's a soapbox around here. Father, I speak so strongly about this because you and I have wrestled so many times over this. The strength of this conviction that comes out of my voice is only because I've done this wrong so many times. There's no victory in it. There's no life in it. There's no truth in it. Father, strengthen our minds with the truth. Anybody here, Father, that for a moment has looked at the cross and said to you, I accept the payment of Jesus' blood, stands acquitted, stands righteous before you for eternity, no matter what is going on. Today, yesterday, or tomorrow. Pound that truth into our soul. Stamp it on our forehead. As a community, help us to remind each other of that so we don't stray from the truth and follow a God that does not exist, the wage earner, the employer. Thank you for our freedom. Thank you for the openness that you give us to be ourselves before you and before one another. Thank you that you're handling life on our behalf. That's our only response. And we say it as a church. We say that.